Have you ever invited someone over for something as simple as tea, only to have the afternoon turn into a moment you'll never forget? That's exactly what happened to me. And even now, as I think about it, my hands tremble slightly. It's strange how ordinary moments can hold within them the beginnings of something profound, something that lingers in your heart long after the cups have been cleared away. Before I tell you everything, I'd love to know where you're joining me from. Which city are you watching this story in? I find comfort in picturing the faces behind the names, scattered across towns and cities, listening quietly as I share a piece of my life, a memory that changed the rhythm of my days. It was one of those cool spring afternoons that feel calm and forgiving, when the world seems to move a little slower. The sunlight was soft, filtered through thin clouds, painting everything with a silver glow. In my small suburban neighborhood, the air smelled faintly of damp soil and blooming lilacs. Birds hopped along the fence, chirping with a kind of quiet enthusiasm that only early spring brings. At 57, I had learned to appreciate these quiet hours, moments of stillness that felt like gifts. I no longer craved the noise or speed of the younger years. Instead, I found joy in my routines, watering the roses, arranging the cushions on the porch chairs, and setting the table with care, as if expecting an old friend rather than a new acquaintance. That day, I had prepared a tray with 2 cups, a pot of chamomile tea, and a plate of homemade lemon cookies, dusted lightly with sugar. The simple sweetness of the cookies filled the house with a comforting aroma that reminded me of my mother's kitchen. I wasn't expecting anything unusual, just a pleasant afternoon, shared over warm tea and small talk. My guest was Marcus, my son's friend, a young man of 26 who had helped me earlier in the week with some heavy boxes from the attic. I'd known him casually for a while. He was polite, reserved, and carried himself with the calm presence of someone thoughtful. There was something steady about him, though I could sense an undercurrent of restlessness, the kind that often follows people still trying to find their place in the world. When I texted him to thank him for his help, I'd added almost as an afterthought, "If you ever have time, come by for tea one afternoon." He replied almost instantly, saying he'd love to. I hadn't expected such eagerness, but I was pleased nonetheless. When he said he could come that very afternoon, I agreed, thinking nothing more of it than a kind gesture returned. From the kitchen window, I watched him walk up the garden path. His steps were slow and measured, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. His head was slightly bowed, as though he were deep in thought, or perhaps carrying something unsaid. The magnolia trees that lined the path swayed gently above him, their petals pale and delicate against the grey sky. When he reached the porch, I opened the door with a smile, hoping to put him at ease. "Marcus," I greeted warmly. "You found the place all right?" He smiled back, a small hesitant curve of his lips that seemed to tremble at the corners. "Of course. Thank you for having me." We settled into the porch chairs, the cushions still warm from the afternoon sun. The teapot hissed softly as I poured, and steam curled into the cool air like threads of silk. He cupped his hands around the mug, but didn't drink right away. His eyes drifted over the garden, tracing the wooden swing, the rows of tulips just beginning to open, and finally they met mine. There was something searching in his gaze, something unspoken. "You've been quiet today," I said lightly, trying to make the moment easier. "Everything all right?" He inhaled, then exhaled, his breath slow and steady. "I didn't come just for tea," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "There's something I've been wanting to tell you, but I didn't know how." The words hung between us, fragile and heavy, all at once. I felt my heart give a small, startled flutter as I realized that this simple afternoon, this innocent invitation for tea, was about to become something I would never forget. My pulse quickened as I sat there, the warmth of the teacup fading against my palms. His words echoed in the air, soft but charged, carrying a weight I couldn't quite place yet. There was something in his tone, steady but trembling at the edges, that told me this wasn't something casual or rehearsed. Marcus sat forward slightly, his hands still clasped around the cup, as though holding it together might steady his thoughts. For a moment, I simply watched him, noticing the way the light fell across his face, the faint tension in his jaw, the way his shoulders lifted, as if bracing for what came next. "I respect you," he began, his voice low, his eyes focused somewhere on the table between us. "More than you probably realize. You've been a kind of anchor for me these past few months. An anchor." The word stayed with me, simple but deeply telling. He continued after a pause. "I don't have many people I can talk to who actually listen. Most people hear you, but they don't listen. You do. You make space for silence. And for someone like me, that means more than I can say." The sincerity in his tone disarmed me. I had expected small talk, polite gratitude for the tea, maybe some conversation about my son or his work. But this was something else entirely. There was vulnerability in him, not the reckless kind that seeks attention, but the quiet kind that reveals truth. "I didn't realize you felt that way," I said softly, my words careful, measured. "I'm glad you can talk to me. That's important." He gave a small, unsteady laugh, his fingers tightening around the cup. "It's more than that," he said after a breath. "I didn't know how to tell you because I didn't want to disrespect you or your son. But I think," he hesitated, looking up at me with eyes that seemed to search for permission to continue. "I think I've developed feelings for you." The words fell into the quiet, like stones dropped into still water. The world seemed to hold its breath. Even the wind paused, leaving the chimes hanging silent. I stared at him, trying to process what he had just said. His face was open, earnest, stripped of any pretense. He wasn't joking. He wasn't impulsive. He was simply honest. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. My heart pounded, not with fear, but with something far more complex. A mixture of surprise, tenderness, and disbelief. I had spent years in the comfort of solitude, my emotions steady, predictable, and now, with just a few words, the balance had shifted. "That's a lot to share," I murmured finally, finding my voice again. "And very brave of you." Marcus lowered his gaze, a faint flush creeping into his cheeks. "I don't expect anything," he said quickly. I just couldn't keep it inside anymore. It felt dishonest, pretending it wasn't there. His honesty pierced through me in a way I hadn't expected. It wasn't about romance, not really. It was about truth, about someone daring to speak from the heart, no matter how complicated it might be. For a long moment, we sat without speaking. The air between us was still, heavy with the scent of chamomile and lemon cookies. I could hear the faint hum of a bee near the tulips, the distant sound of a lawnmower somewhere down the street. Everything else had gone quiet. Finally, I reached across the table and placed my hand gently over his. His fingers tensed for a second, then relaxed beneath my touch. "Thank you for telling me," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "It takes courage to be that honest. Let's not rush to define what this means. Let's just sit for a while." He nodded, exhaling a long breath he seemed to have been holding for hours. We sat like that, in silence. Two people surrounded by the muted hum of the world, both changed by words that could not be taken back. As the sunlight dimmed and shadows stretched across the porch, I realized something unexpected. My heart wasn't afraid. It was awake, not because of what Marcus had said, but because of what it reminded me, that even in quiet years, life still holds the power to surprise you, to stir something deep within, something you thought had long gone still. The next morning arrived cloaked in the quiet hush that follows a night of rain. The garden glistened as though it had been dusted with tiny diamonds, each droplet catching the faint morning light. I stood by the kitchen window, my coffee cooling beside me, replaying Marcus's words in my mind. I think I've developed feelings for you." The sentence echoed softly, not as a shock anymore, but as something delicate that needed careful handling. His honesty had unsettled me, but not in a way that frightened me. It had stirred something deeper, an awareness of how rare it was for someone to speak from the heart without pretense or fear. I spent the morning moving slowly through the house, tidying small things that didn't really need attention. The quiet felt louder than usual. The ticking of the clock on the wall, the creak of the floorboards, everything seemed amplified, as though my world had grown more alert overnight. I thought about Marcus's expression, the sincerity in his eyes, and how, even as he spoke, he'd looked more uncertain than bold. I wondered what I had meant to him, and what this moment might mean for both of us. By the time I sat down with my second cup of coffee, I noticed my phone buzzing softly on the counter. It was a message from Marcus. "Thank you for listening yesterday. Could we talk again if you're comfortable?" The words were gentle, considerate, leaving the decision entirely with me. I read them twice, feeling both apprehensive and oddly calm. After a pause, I typed back, "Come by at 5. We can sit in the garden." The hours between morning and evening seemed to stretch endlessly. I busied myself with small tasks, watering the plants, dusting the bookshelves, rearranging a few picture frames on the mantel, anything to keep from overthinking. By the time the clock struck 5, the sky had softened into a pale amber glow, and the garden smelled of magnolia and rain-damp earth. When Marcus arrived, he looked a little more composed than the day before, though the tension still lingered around his eyes. I had set the small iron table beneath the magnolia tree, a pot of peppermint tea steaming gently between us this time. We greeted each other quietly, both aware that the air carried unspoken things. "I didn't sleep much last night," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I kept thinking I'd ruined everything." "You didn't ruin anything," I said, and I meant it. My voice came out softer than I expected, steady and kind. "You were honest. That takes courage." He looked up at me, relief flickering in his eyes. "I just needed you to know how I felt, even if nothing comes of it. I didn't want my feelings to turn into confusion or regret." I stirred my tea slowly, watching the ripples settle. "Marcus," I began gently, "you're young, and I'm in a very different season of life." What you said surprised me, but it also reminded me that I'm still seen. I'm grateful for that. He held my gaze, and for a moment his expression softened completely. "I don't see you as just my friend's mother," he said quietly. "I see you as a person, someone who listens, who has warmth, who has depth. That's rare." His words settled into the air like sunlight breaking through clouds. I felt my chest tighten with emotion, a blend of tenderness and something close to sadness. I had spent so many years quietly fading into the background, tending to others while forgetting how it felt to be truly seen. "I value our connection," I said, choosing each word carefully. "I don't know what it means yet, but if you'd like, we can keep talking. About life, about anything." His lips curved into a small, almost shy smile. "I'd like that," he said simply. And so we sat beneath the magnolia tree. As the light filtered through the branches, in shifting patterns of gold and green, the hum of bees and the gentle rustle of leaves filled the silence between our words. There was no rush, no expectation, only the quiet understanding that something had changed between us. Not love, not even the beginning of it, but a kind of fragile recognition that honesty, once spoken, creates its own space, one that neither of us quite knew how to leave. Days passed, and life slipped back into its familiar rhythm. Or at least it appeared to. Yet beneath that quiet normalcy, something subtle had shifted. I found myself glancing toward the garden more often than usual, as if expecting Marcus to appear at the gate. When he did visit, it was never announced dramatically or planned in advance. Sometimes he'd text, sometimes he'd simply knock, holding a book he thought I might like, or a box of pastries from a small bakery downtown. His presence became a soft thread in my days, unobtrusive, but warm. We talked about ordinary things, his work, his childhood memories, the places he wanted to see someday. I shared stories about my son when he was little, about my garden, about the years that had shaped me quietly. Our conversations never strayed into the territory of what had been said on that first afternoon, yet the weight of it remained, like a note sustained just beneath the surface of our words. One evening, as the sun was setting behind the magnolia tree, I saw him waiting at the gate again. The sky was painted in streaks of gold and rose, and the air carried the scent of jasmine. I could tell by the way he stood, hands deep in his pockets, shoulders slightly stiff, that something was weighing on him. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. "Of course," I replied, stepping aside. He followed me up the path, the gravel crunching softly beneath his shoes. We settled on the porch again, where I'd already placed a teapot and 2 cups, the steam curling gently into the air. For a while he said nothing. He just sat there, eyes fixed on the horizon, as if searching for the right words among the fading colors of the evening. Finally he spoke. "I've been thinking about what you said, about taking things slowly, about not rushing to define anything. I want to respect that. I really do." He paused, his fingers tightening around the handle of his cup. "But I also can't ignore what I feel." I set my cup down carefully, giving him my full attention. "Feelings aren't meant to be ignored," I said gently. "But we do have to be mindful of what we do with them. That's the harder part, balancing honesty with respect." He nodded, swallowing hard. "Sometimes I can't stop thinking about you," he confessed, his voice almost breaking. "Not in a passing way, but constantly. You're in my thoughts when I wake up, when I leave work, even when I'm doing nothing at all." I didn't mean for it to happen, but it did. There was no demand in his tone, no desperation, just quiet truth. I took a slow breath, feeling the warmth of the tea seep through my palms. "You're not a burden, Marcus," I said softly. "You're human, and what you're sharing shows trust. That matters more than you realize." He looked up at me then, and in that moment, something in his expression changed. The tension that had gripped him for days seemed to ease slightly. "Would it be all right," he asked, "if I stayed a little longer, just to talk? Nothing more." A smile tugged at my lips before I could stop it. "Of course," I said. "That's all I want too." He leaned back in his chair, visibly relieved, and began telling me a story about something funny that had happened at work earlier that day. His laughter filled the air, rich and genuine, and before long, I found myself laughing too. Deep, unguarded laughter that I hadn't felt in years. As we laughed together, I noticed how different the garden felt. The evening light shimmered through the magnolia leaves, and the soft murmur of crickets filled the air. The tension between us had transformed into something gentler, something that didn't need definition or labels. It was simply connection, the quiet kind that grows from being fully seen and heard. When Marcus finally stood to leave, the first stars were beginning to appear. He paused at the gate and turned back to me. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for not shutting me out." I nodded, feeling a calm warmth settle over me. "Thank you," I replied, "for trusting me with your truth." As he disappeared down the street, I stayed on the porch for a long time, the echo of our laughter lingering in the air. Something about that evening stayed with me. Not the words, not the confession, but the honesty we shared, the mutual understanding that had formed between 2 very different lives. It wasn't romance, not yet, perhaps not ever. It was something rarer, an unspoken recognition that sometimes, in the simplest company, the heart rediscovers its own quiet pulse. The days that followed unfolded with a gentle rhythm, neither hurried nor still, Life seemed to move around me in quiet circles. The same walks through the garden, the same sun pouring through the kitchen window, the same steady hum of ordinary things. And yet, beneath all that familiarity, something inside me had softened. The air seemed lighter, the mornings brighter, as if Marcus's presence had awakened a small dormant spark I hadn't realized had been fading. He continued to visit, though never out of obligation. Sometimes he'd come by with no more reason than to share a story, or to sit silently on the porch, watching the light shift through the trees. There were no expectations between us, no words about what might come next. The space we shared was one of ease and mutual respect, a fragile, honest kind of peace. One late afternoon, he arrived just as I was tending to the roses. The sun hung low, its light slanting gold across the garden. He leaned against the fence, watching quietly for a while before saying, "You look peaceful out here." I smiled, brushing dirt from my hands. The garden doesn't judge. It just grows when it's cared for. He nodded thoughtfully. Maybe people are the same way. The simplicity of his words struck me. For all his youth, Marcus carried a kind of clarity that reminded me how wisdom doesn't always come from age, but from paying attention to life, to others, to oneself. We sat afterward on the old wooden bench beneath the magnolia tree. The scent of earth and new blossoms lingered between us. He told me about a project at work that had been frustrating him, how he was struggling to find his footing in a world that seemed to move too fast. I listened, as I always did, not to offer advice, but to give space for his words to land. When he finished, I said, "You're doing better than you think. Growth isn't loud. It's often quiet, like this." He smiled faintly, his eyes meeting mine. "You always make things sound lighter," he said. "Like the world isn't as heavy as it feels." "I don't make it lighter," I replied softly. "I just remind you that you're strong enough to carry it." Something in his expression shifted then, his usual guardedness giving way to warmth. "I don't know what I'd do without these talks," he said. I felt a tenderness rise in me, one that wasn't romantic, but deeply human. It was the warmth of connection, of two people who had found understanding in a world that often forgot to listen. As twilight deepened, we sat in companionable silence. The air grew cool, the first stars blinking awake above us. I realized then that our connection had become something steady and grounding, a quiet exchange of kindness that asked for nothing in return. It wasn't about love or longing. It was about the rare comfort of being seen without judgment and of seeing someone else in return. When Marcus finally stood to leave, he turned to me with a soft smile. "You've changed the way I see things," he said. "You make me want to be gentler, with myself, with others." His words stayed with me long after he left. I sat there for a while, listening to the night settle in, the crickets beginning their song. I thought about how life has a way of bringing people into our paths, for reasons we don't always understand. Some stay, some drift away, but each leaves something behind, a lesson, a feeling, a reminder. That night, as I closed the garden gate, I felt an unexpected sense of peace. Whatever this connection with Marcus was meant to be, it had already done its work. It had reminded me that kindness still exists, that truth spoken softly can heal more than silence ever could, and that sometimes the most meaningful relationships are the ones that ask for nothing except honesty and presence. And as the stars spread across the darkening sky, I found myself smiling. Not for what had been said, but for what had been felt. Something had changed within me, something small but lasting. I no longer felt invisible. I no longer felt like a background character in my own story. I was awake again, and that, I realized, was enough.